Pat Murphy's here from Bucknuts, breaking down Ohio State football. We're going through the offense today. And, typically there are polls out there and questionnaires concerning, what fans are most concerned with each offseason, whether that's in the spring or the fall. Well, if we went least concerned, I think we would go wide receiver pretty much for like 12 years in a row now. And they just, while it seems impossible to improve the wide receiver core, this school seems to do it somehow. Mekabuka moves on, but with the emergence of a guy like possibly a Brandon Inniss in particular, or a Mylan Graham, we would expect this thing just to keep rolling. I don't know how much better Jeremiah Smith can get. And of course, Carnell Tate was could have been a number one guy on 95% of the teams in the country.
It is a luxury that Ohio State has had not only this year, not only last year, but as you mentioned, for several years here under Brian Hartline, even going back to Zach Smith. Jeremiah Smith looks already bigger, if you can imagine that. Ohio State posted a picture of him on social media where just like that kid is barely, he's not even done with his freshman school year, right? And you know what he did during the season. I don't know how you improve upon that, but Brian Hartline talked recently, the new Ohio State, newly promoted, I guess is what we're saying, even though he's had the title before, offensive coordinator and obviously wide receivers coach. The challenge will be getting Jeremiah Smith to take it to the next step. What does that mean? I don't know what you do, but he's a kid who works hard. I don't expect there to be any sort of buying into the hype. He's had plenty of hype throughout his career. Carnell Tate, you mentioned, that's a guy I think you could see take a big leap statistically this season. And you got kind of a preview of that in the Texas game when the Longhorns focused on taking Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka away. Well, Carnell Tate's pretty good. I think it was like 8 receptions for 79 yards or something along those lines. He can put up real numbers. I mean, this was one of the top receivers in the country coming out of high school. And then Brandon Inniss, that's a guy you expect to slot right in to the slot. The role of Emeka Egbuka vacated. He's a guy who's just waited his time patiently these last 2 seasons. Another guy who, had he wanted to, he could have hopped in the transfer portal, been a starter somewhere else, but has played his role, has made some important plays for Ohio State, both as a receiver and as a return man. But he will certainly have a much bigger role. Beyond that, we'll see if Brian Hartline goes any deeper, but you mentioned Mylan Graham. That's a guy who didn't arrive on campus until last summer, but a guy that they really like. Bryson Rogers is going into his 3rd year, somebody who could also help out in the slot. And, they've got some young guys coming in. I mean, it's quite the group of wide receivers that Brian Hartline has compiled once again. And you're going to miss Emeka Egbuka, no doubt. He is the all-time leading receiver in program history, but you just have the next guy stepping up, and that's the way it's been in that room.
By extension, Pat, we'll look at the tight ends. And of course, G. Scott, he really finished off his career with a bang with some key plays in the playoff. We're looking at Jelani Thurman. Will Kazmir caught 8 passes, of course, coming in from the MAC and Ohio University. But this Max Clare, I don't know what it is in regards to what's going on at Purdue, but they were probably the worst. They were the worst team in the country in power conference play. They were atrocious. They went 0-11, and it seems like everybody just picks apart that team, and they must have had like 5 NFL players, and everybody else was awful. But Max Clare was one of these guys who was an all Big Ten tight end despite playing for a horrendous Purdue team, and he may be a go-to this year.
It will be interesting to see what Ohio State does with a guy like Max Clare, because you mentioned G. Scott, who was a former wide receiver, really highly recruited wide receiver who transitioned to tight end and never put up big numbers in the Ohio State offense. Was an important part of the offense, especially last season. But you even go back to a Cade Stover the 2 years before that. Like statistically, you don't look at those guys and be like, wow, right? Because mainly you have those wide receivers you can throw the ball to. You've got running backs you can give the ball to. So Ohio State's never needed like a Brock Bowers, for instance, where or a Tyler Warren for Penn State last year, where the tight end becomes a feature in their offense. But then you go and get a guy like Max Clare. Like clearly there is a plan there because, as you mentioned, an all Big Ten tight end, a guy who is probably more of a receiver than he is a blocker, similar to Jelani Thurman, who's going to enter his third season in the program, and should have an even bigger role this next year. So I'll be interested to see, only one football, right? You've got these receivers you want to get the ball to. We talked about the running backs. Where does a guy like Max Clare kind of fit in the pecking order of, not that you spend every play trying to get somebody the ball, but I imagine this is a guy who's going to want some catches, probably making a decent chunk of change from the NIL stuff. If he's not a great blocker, which based on watching him at Purdue, he has not been. Now, that doesn't mean it's not something that he can get better at. But an interesting addition by Ohio State, given that they haven't featured tight ends like other programs have. Will Kazmarik's a guy that I'm interested in seeing more of, because he did get hurt in that Oregon game, missed several games, came back. I think he's definitely the number 2 tight end who will do a lot of the blocking stuff, but can still hurt teams if they don't pay attention to him. I mentioned Jelani Thurman. It's kind of getting to put up or shut up time. And that's not an insult to Jelani Thurman. That's more just he hasn't had an opportunity to get on the field. Bennett Christian, another guy who can do, kind of the nice blocking and can make some catches. So a number of bodies there. They've got some young guys as well. Again, only so many guys are going to play, but you saw last year, I think those 3 tight ends and G. Scott, Will Kazmarek, and Jelani Thurman made for a nice group that did what Ohio State needed. And we'll see how that expands going into 2025.
On the Move is our recently launched recruiting and portal show that we do every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern time on our newly launched recruiting channel with Leanne Herring. And keep in mind, folks, that boy, she is delivering some top-notch commits and targets out there. So we got 2 more interviews today with 2 top 250 players for the 2026 recruiting class. So check it out Tuesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern time.